Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and today my guest is Bud Norman. Bud was a reporter for many years at the Wichita Eagle, covering a variety of beats, including state government in Topeka. Today he is a novelist, a freelance writer, and author of the blog The Central Standard Times, subtitled A View from the Middle of America. You can read that at centralstandardtimes.com and also sign up for the daily email. So, Bud Norman, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV.
Thanks for the invitation.
I should mention to my viewers, you notice my hand here. It's the same surgery I had back in June, just to correct a defect in my hand. So nothing serious, and it'll get better as we go along. So, of course, we've had the election. We're recording the Thursday after Election Day, and I think everybody is quite full of surprise. One thing that I think hasn't been noted so far, and these are figures from the Associated Press with 99% of the nationwide vote reporting, is that Hillary Clinton actually got more votes than Donald Trump did. It's a margin of 0.02%, 233,000 votes. It's like 1 part in 250. So it's like 250 people over here voted for Clinton, 251 over there voted for Donald Trump. Yet people are saying this was a revolution or something, but actually it was already pretty close.
It was exceedingly close, and if you also look at the totals, you'll notice that Trump actually got fewer votes than Romney did 4 years ago.
I think I read about 1 million less, but Hillary Clinton got about 6 million less than Barack Obama did.
I think it was more than 6 million less than Barack Obama did.
So we had a low turnout election then.
Well, the race all along was between two very unpopular people. It's odd that you wind up with two candidates, both of whom have unfavorable numbers in the 60s.
Mm-hmm. And the one with the most unfavorable won, although I don't think there was a huge difference in the unfavorable.
By the end of the race, they were about neck and neck for the most hated person in America title. And the election came down to really a matter of which of these two people the public disliked more. And as it turns out, they disliked them pretty much equally, but given, that there were more people in Wisconsin and Michigan and Iowa and Florida, those were the states that flipped. And so if you're just a little less unpopular in those states, you wind up as president.
And that's, one of the quirks of the Electoral College. Like, I think Clinton got about 2.5 million more votes in California than Trump did, but that doesn't really mean anything. It's a handful of votes in a handful of states, sometimes just even a handful of counties that really determine the election.
Yeah, she also won New York. They're the fourth most populous state now, New York, but still, it's one of the big states, and Clinton won by a very significant margin there. Yeah. And Florida, as Florida tends to be, was exceedingly close. But, not hanging Chad's close.
Right. Well, that is, I think, the relief that everybody seems to be accepting that there was no widespread voter fraud enough to tip the election one way or the other. So at least we can put that behind us.
You're not hearing any talk of a rigged election from Trump anymore.
And, that was one of the sad things to see as things go along, like when James Comey, right after the 4th of July, said, no prosecution for Hillary. Almost every Republican across the country is saying, he's a sellout, a phony, a fraud. Then, a week and a half before election, when he said, well, wait a minute, then Donald Trump loved him, and then he hated him just a few days later.
Comey was hated by the right one day, the left the next day, and then the right again the next day.
So do you think that things like that, and I mean the Democrats, they had the shifting opinion too of the Department of Justice and the FBI. Do you think things like that are it used to be a time when people really trusted the federal government. Polls would ask, do you trust the federal government to do what's right most of the time?
Yeah.
And there used to be big answers for yes. That's been going down over the years. And do you think that this election is going to drive those favorability ratings down even further?
I think every institution in America right now is in disrepute.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of the mainstream religious leaders are less respected. Certainly, the media's influence is not what it used to be, or a President Trump would not have happened.
Well,
A nominee Trump would have happened because the media made a huge mistake. I think that they were just giggling that we're going to foist Trump on the Republican Party and he'll be so easy to beat.
Yeah.
And then it turns out that they can't beat him, and now they're stuck with him for 4 years.
Yeah, 4 years, maybe 8, who knows there. So, but on the Central Standard Times, on Election Day, you wrote this: but for the first time in our lives, we won't be voting for the Republican at the top of the ticket. A little bit later, you wrote, at least the record will reflect that someone took a stand at a scenic spot on the Little Arkansas River against this crazy election year and will hold out faint hope that will do some good.
Yeah. Well, I should emphasize that it's also in there that I wasn't voting for Clinton. I just couldn't bring myself to vote
Well,
for
I think in
either
another
of them.
post you revealed who you voted for, so I'm not...
Yeah, I don't mind telling you I voted for that Evan McMullin
He was
fellow.
the independent candidate.
And everyone, I mentioned this too, the reaction is, what's an Evan McMullin?
Yeah, and
It's not, they're thinking it's something on the menu at McDonald's.
yeah, and I voted for Gary Johnson myself, the
can't blame
Libertarian candidate. And what's kind of sad to me is that at one time, Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, his running mate, they were polling at 8, 9, 10%, even more. At the end, they got 3.25%. So maybe perhaps people were flirting with the idea of a third party early on, but then as it comes down to crunch time...
What happened is a lot of people, I can't vote for Donald Trump, and then as the prospect of Hillary Clinton becoming president sinks in, they can't have that either. Also, I was very disappointed that Johnson and Weld ran a horrible campaign.
Yeah.
The most famous moments, of course, were when he was unable to answer, basic current events questions. I think that they could have made a pitch to conservatives better. One thing that really surprised me that their stand on religious liberty was very disappointing to me.
On the other hand, they were two accomplished politicians in their own right, Republicans who governed blue states and managed to be reelected, and then didn't run again, I think, as a term limits.
Which makes it all the more surprising that they ran such an inept campaign.
Yeah, of course, they didn't have the money that the two major parties had, but still, that didn't prevent him from saying,
another interesting thing about this election is Trump kind of disproves some of the rules about money and spending and advertising.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe if Johnson had just been a little more outrageous and started getting all the kinds of free media that Trump got,
that could have done it, perhaps.
Cursed more or, been more insulting to somebody.
Yeah, he needed to pick on somebody some more. But hold on to that thought. We're going to take a moment off for a commercial break. This is Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. With me this week, Bud Norman, writer at the CentralStandardTimes.com. So, in one of your columns, you mentioned regarding to Donald Trump, the candidate, his ever-shifting positions on the issues. And now we have President-elect Trump. He is going to be president, bar some sort of catastrophe of some sort. Do we really know who Donald Trump is and the things that he stands for?
I think that we have a pretty good idea at this point who he is, but I think what he stands for is a work in progress. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was, I believe he didn't become a Republican until 2013.
Not real long ago, yeah.
And in the past, and even over the course of the campaign, during the campaign, he was talking about health care for everyone and the government's going to pay for it, which is not, of course,
That's
a traditional Republican position at all. I think that you can be sure that protectionist policy of his is a core belief, because he's been writing about that and bringing it up in interviews for a long time. In fact, long enough that he was very critical of Ronald Reagan during the Reagan administration.
So that is one of his key things always has been that the Carrier plant in Indiana, in particular, as an example he used, they moved all the jobs to Mexico. So now, if Carrier wants to bring these air conditioners back in, they're going to have to pay 35% tax or something like that. But does he need Congress to do that? Do you know? Or
I don't. I think the presidents have a considerable power. You'll recall that George W. Bush briefly, pretty much unilaterally imposed steel tariffs,
and I know pretty soon,
and quickly backtracked on that, but he was able to do that for a while.
And pretty soon after Obama came in, he put sanctions or tariffs on Chinese tires coming in. And the thing is, immediately the Chinese turned around and put tariffs on imported chicken from the United States. So that's what happens. It's not just simply a bilateral thing. Trade works in both ways, and if one party does something, the other may retaliate, and that would be bad for our economy.
That's a big worry I have, is that he's going to provoke a trade war. And although Kansas wound up voting for Trump in pretty much the same numbers they vote for every Republican, I think your two big industries in Kansas are agricultural and aviation, and both are
very much export
reliant. And I would listen to that 500 AM radio station from way out in western Kansas. It's all farm talk all day, and they were not inclined to badmouth a Republican nominee for anything, but there was a lot. I was interested that there was a lot of concern on those shows about what's going to happen to agricultural exports, especially to China.
Mm-hmm. And I would think they would also be concerned about one of the other Trump signature things, which was build the wall, because southwest Kansas, western Kansas, very heavily reliant on immigrant labor for a lot of things. Maybe they're legal immigrants or maybe they're not, but I think they'd be concerned about that too.
Yeah, although at the same time, there are the inevitable cultural frictions that come with that kind of thing, and I think that at least the white working class western Kansans are very ambivalent about illegal immigration.
Do you think
or immigration even legal?
Do you think that Trump will be able to build the walls, set aside whether making Mexico pay for it or not, but build and I ask this because it seems like once or twice a year on TV you see, we discovered this tunnel under the Mexican border. And I mean, these things have railways in them. They've got utilities and ventilation and everything. Those are used for mostly smuggling drugs. But it seems to me that to build an impenetrable wall would be very difficult to do.
I would think so. China built a wall.
Yeah.
And you don't see a whole lot of illegal Mexican immigrants there.
And that's, another funny thing. Some people have been talking about that. People in the United States who fear immigrants, they're labeled xenophobic or anti-Muslim or whatever. Well, in most countries of the world, you can't go there and just immigrate. You can't, for example, Japan, I don't think. You can't become, and you can become a Japanese American or a Chinese American, having been born in another country and moved to America. But you can't become an American Japanese. In other words, an American who decides to become Japanese. I don't think you can do that.
Oh, and what you're seeing in Europe is a lot of these countries that have taken in a large number of
well, Germany and France.
There's still an ethnic identity that is involved in defining your status. And even if you're, say, a Turkish immigrant to Germany, you might achieve full citizenship, and you would be German in the sense that American citizenship makes you American, but there is still a certain Teutonic. You're not Teutonic. You're not fully German.
One of your columns also you wrote about looking back at Barack Obama's win in 2008, that there was, after 2 years of Democratic Congress and Democratic President, there was a big landslide, big shift election to a Republican Congress. And also along that time, right after Barack Obama took office, there was the rise to the Tea Party. I remember you and I being there on North Waco Street on a bitterly cold day in February, windy, in 2009. That was at the very beginning of the Tea Party. Do you see that there could be some sort of movement like that, but going the other way? In other words, the Democrats...
It's already begun. You've got, I don't know if you saw the stories, but this morning I was reading about the rioting in Oakland and mass demonstrations elsewhere. And what happened in 2008 was you had kind of a cult of personality leader that everyone's going to follow. He's going to bring hope and change. He's got Congress on his side. He's got big majorities there, and they went hog wild with it. They did stuff, Obamacare, the stimulus package,
and now we have a president
things that were just seemed intended to provoke a reaction from the right. And I can easily see Trump and in his case, Paul Ryan's not going to be quite as willing to go along with whatever Trump wants to do as Pelosi was willing to go along with whatever Obama does. But to the extent that Ryan offers any resistance, it's going to be a very nasty political battle there.
Yeah, especially because, very many Republicans were not at all Trump supporters or even reluctant Trump supporters. So hold on to those ideas, bud. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the election in Kansas. This is Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. With me this week, Bud Norman of CentralStandardTimes.com. So looking here in Kansas, of course, we had elections in here. No statewide offices like governor or anything like that were up. And all of our federal offices, not much drama in any of those two. Jerry Moran cruised, Mike Pompeo, Lynn Jenkins and Kevin Yoder did, although in western Kansas there will be a new member of Congress, Roger Marshall, who had defeated Tim Huelskamp in the primary there.
There was some thought that the congressman up representing the Kansas City suburbs might be in trouble, but that proved
he had a more narrower victory. He got, I think, 51 or 52% of the vote. There was a libertarian who gathered quite a bit of the vote, but in the end, it wasn't as close as some people might have thought. But in our legislature, our state legislature, between the primary election in August and the general election here in November, now there's more of a working coalition of the moderate Republicans plus the Democrats. Some people are saying in the House of Representatives they might have about 70 votes in that coalition. That's enough to pass bills. You need 63. But it's not enough to override vetoes. And in the Senate, it's pretty much even in that coalition there. So we're probably going to see some things different in the legislature this year.
We're probably not going to see much happening at all, I would guess, which is fine by me. At least I'm kind of a fan of gridlock.
Yeah.
If they're not doing anything, that means they're not doing anything stupid.
Mm-hmm. And one other big election, well, actually a series of elections that was contested this year in Kansas, was retention of some judges on the Kansas Supreme Court.
That was a huge issue, by the way.
Lots of money spent on both sides.
Oh, and also, just from anecdotal evidence, I gather a widely followed race. Everyone I would run into, you get to talk in politics, that came up almost every time.
It was the subject of stories in the New York Times and other nationwide media. So 5 Supreme Court justices were up for retention. They were all retained, 4 of them by margins of 55 to 56%. Those are the 4 that conservatives targeted for non-retention. The one judge, Caleb Stegall, that conservatives were comfortable with, he got 71% of the vote for retaining. So maybe the campaign had an effect, but in the end, all the judges were retained.
Yeah, and I frankly am a little bit surprised by that because I
think
sensed
there have been
a
some
real
pollings that showed it maybe narrowly going the other way, that they would be non-retained.
And there's a throw the bums out mood that I thought would carry the day, and the advertising focused on the controversial decision to grant a retrial to the notorious Carr brothers.
Well, not really a retrial, just a resentencing it was. So they were never declared to be not guilty, just the death penalty was overturned.
You're correct. But that winds up in the U.S. Supreme Court where they lose 8-1, which means they're to the left of at least 3 very left-wing Supreme Court judges. That's quite a rebuke.
Yeah, it is. And I looked back at some of the transcripts of the oral arguments, and Justice Scalia was wondering, he asked Derek Schmidt, our Attorney General, who argued one of the cases, that did the Kansas Supreme Court read the cases we made in earlier rulings regarding Kansas? And Justice Sotomayor, a liberal justice, says, she was astonished. She thought, I must be overlooking something to understand why the Kansas court ruled the way that they did. So I've thought, we have what's called the merit selection in Kansas, but when you're slammed over and over again by the United States Supreme Court in unanimous or near unanimous margins,
including Supreme Court justices that your average Kansan would consider too far left. I found it interesting, though, that the No campaign didn't make a bigger issue out of the courts meddling in the education funding issue, which was a bigger deal to me, frankly.
Seems like the Carr brothers was an emotional issue.
The Carr brothers, it goes right to emotion. That stuff, it gets into the debate over who's right about school funding. And these days, people have the idea that if you're in favor of a policy, that the court should do that. And whether it's constitutional or not. But I don't see that as the role of the judiciary. Mm-hmm. And although there is a provision in the Constitution that funding has to be, equitable?
Suitable funding.
Suitable funding.
What the heck does that mean?
Well, I think that if the legislature just, decided to stop sending money or something like that, the court would be fair to step in. But when it's a matter of, are we going to be spending $13,000 per pupil or 12 or 14, I don't see that it's the court's role to say, well, this is
they
where
were
suitability.
really exercising judicial restraint, you might think they would say, this is not our business. That's a legislative issue. We've just got a minute or two left, Bud, but there could be other changes in Kansas government coming around. Chris Kobach, our Secretary of State, was an early and enthusiastic supporter of Donald Trump. He's on Trump's transition team.
And he has a long-standing reputation as an anti-immigration hardliner.
Right, which is Donald Trump's
anti-illegal immigration, rather.
And Governor Brownback, who was the Secretary of Agriculture in the state of Kansas before he went to Congress, he's being floated as potential Secretary of Agriculture. So that would be a couple pretty big, especially the governor.
Well, that would make sense. Brownback's undergraduate bachelor's degree is in agricultural economics, and he comes from a farm family, and he's been governor of a farm state.
And he has experience in both the House of Representatives and the Senate.
And I think that that would be a smart pick. It wouldn't surprise me at all.
Yeah.
And I all my liberal friends on Facebook are saying, please, Trump, get Brownback out of Kansas. So
some people, though, I say, don't let Brownback do to the country what he did to Kansas, and that's a whole ball of wax there. But as Secretary of Agriculture, you don't have near as much power as the governor of Kansas, I think.
Well, no, it's an executive position. You just make sure that you make sure that the subsidy checks get sent out in time.
Of course, you are in charge of the food stamp program, too, there, or SNAP, or whatever it's called. So anyway, Bud, we've run out of time. It's been a pleasure, so I'm going to shake left-handed. But thank you very much, Bud Norman, for being on Wichita Liberty TV. And that's yet another episode. We'll see you next week. I'm Bob Weeks.